The table has been ready for an hour before anyone is due to sit at it, and in that hour it has been touched more times than most pieces of furniture are touched in a year. 2 housemaids ironed the damask cloth flat that afternoon, with irons heated on the kitchen range, then carried it upstairs between them like a stretcher so that not a single fold would crease it before it reached the table. It is April of 1885, in a tall white house on a quiet square in Belgravia, and the dining room glows with the particular gold light of gas jets turned low and candles turned high, the kind of light every hostess of the period has learned flatters silver, flatters skin, and flatters almost nothing else in the room quite so well. Down the center of the cloth runs a line of silver candelabra, tall enough that their light falls warmly across every face at the table without ever quite reaching the ceiling above it, and between them, at careful intervals, sit smaller pieces meant only to be looked at rather than used, a pair of chased silver stags, a low dish of hothouse grapes still faintly dusted with the bloom of the vine. At every place, cutlery has been laid in a row so exact it could have been set with a ruler, because in the best houses it frequently was. Knives to the right, forks to the left, spoons above the plate, each piece assigned to a course that has not yet been served, and a decision that has not yet been made by the person who will eventually sit there. 4 crystal glasses stand at each setting, cut to catch the candlelight and throw small chips of it back across the cloth. 1 for sherry, 1 for hock, 1 for claret, 1 for the champagne that will come with the sweet. And in the exact center of the table, raised above everything else in the room the way an altarpiece is raised above a church, stands a tall vase of cut glass holding a single, carefully trimmed head of celery, its pale stalks fanned upright and its roots hidden, displayed the way another household might display a vase of hothouse orchids or a bowl of fruit no one intends to eat. The lady of the house walks the length of the table once before her guests arrive, the way a general is said to walk the line before an inspection, and she does not smile as she does it. She nudges a fork a half-inch to the left. She turns a wine glass so its cut pattern faces the room rather than the wall. She checks, without appearing to check, that the celery in its vase stands perfectly straight, because a leaning stalk of celery says something about a household that she has spent 15 years making sure her own household never says. Somewhere below her feet, in a kitchen already thick with heat and the smell of stock reducing, a cook is watching a clock nearly as closely as she is watching her own table. Every object on this table has been chosen, positioned, and inspected with the seriousness of a much older, much more dangerous kind of preparation, and in a sense, that is exactly what it is, because beneath all that symmetry, beneath the gleam of 24 pieces of silver and the crystal and the single stalk of celery treated like a jewel, this table is not really being laid for dinner. It is being laid for an examination, and every guest who sits down at it tonight, whether they understand it yet or not, is about to be tested on a syllabus nobody wrote down, marked by judges who will never announce their scores out loud. In a room where a single wrong fork can cost a family a friendship it took a decade to build. This is London in the spring of 1885. Victoria has been on the throne for 48 years. The empire is at the furthest reach it will ever have. And Britain's new commercial wealth, the wealth of shipping lines and cotton mills and colonial trade, has produced more households with real money in them than at any point in the country's history. Money, though, has never been the whole of it. Not in this city and not in this decade. A family can own a fortune within a single generation. Learning to be received by the families who have owned theirs for 3 or 4 generations is a slower, crueler, far less forgiving education, and the dinner table is where that education is conducted, quietly, over soup, in front of witnesses who will remember every mistake. This film is about that education. Not the china patterns or the pretty menus that survive in museum cases, pleasant and bloodless, but the real machinery underneath them, the 14 courses eaten in strict order, the 20-odd pieces of silver a guest was expected to recognize on sight, the conversation a hostess could switch on and off at will, and the punishments, some small and some devastating, waiting for anyone who got it wrong. We are going to sit at this table for the whole of one long evening in 1885 and watch what it actually demanded of the people seated around it, the ones born to it, and the ones still learning its rules by candlelight in their own front rooms, forks borrowed from the kitchen drawer, practicing in the dark where no one could see them fail. Before we go further into that evening, if this kind of honest history, the version behind the polished one, is the sort of thing you value, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps a small channel keep making this kind of work. And if you would like to, leave a comment telling me which era of etiquette or excess you would most like to see taken apart like this next. I read every one of them. Let us begin then, not with the soup, but with the woman standing in her own bedroom 2 hours before the carriage arrives, already half convinced that tonight is going to go badly. Her name is Constance Hartley, and in April of 1885 she is 34 years old, the wife of a solicitor named Edmund Hartley, who has, after 11 careful years in a modest city firm, just been made a junior partner. She is the daughter of a linen draper from Leeds, a man who built a comfortable, unglamorous business out of bolt cloth and careful bookkeeping, and who never once, in his own lifetime, sat down to a meal with more than one fork beside his plate. Constance grew up comfortable rather than grand, taught to sew a fine seam and keep an honest household ledger, and she married a man whose profession, unlike her father's trade, carried the faint, valuable scent of a gentleman's calling. Tonight, that faint scent has finally opened a door neither of them expected quite this soon. Edmund's new position has brought the firm into contact with a shipping family named Calloway, whose fortune runs to 3 merchant vessels and a house on a Belgravia square, and Mrs. Beatrice Calloway, the mistress presently walking the length of that gleaming table, has sent the Hartleys a card inviting them to dine. Constance is a solidly built woman of middling height, neither fashionably slender nor remarkable in any way the current plates in the ladies' magazines would praise, with a round, pleasant face and hands that are, if she is honest with herself in front of the mirror, still a little rough at the knuckles from years of running her own small household before they could afford even one general servant. That servant, a girl named Sarah, who does the cooking, the cleaning, and most of the fetching in the Hartley house, has been pressed into service tonight as an amateur lady's maid, and her efforts at Constance's hair, though earnest, have taken considerably longer than either woman expected. Constance's new gown, a dove grey silk chosen specifically because grey reads as neither too bold nor too poor, has been laced onto her by Edmund himself, since there is no one else in the house to do it, and his unpracticed hands have pulled the stays a full inch tighter than Constance is used to, because he was not entirely sure how firm was firm enough and erred, as men often do in these matters, toward too much rather than too little. What almost no one at tonight's table will ever know is that Constance spent 3 evenings this past week rehearsing. After Sarah had gone to bed and Edmund was occupied with his law papers, she cleared the kitchen table, laid out every fork, knife and spoon the household owned, borrowed 2 more place settings from her own mother, and worked her way through an imagined 14 courses using a battered copy of a household guide propped open against the sugar bowl, moving her hands from the outside in, over and over, until the order stopped feeling like a foreign language and started feeling, almost, like something she might trust her own body to remember under pressure. She has told no one about this. She would be humiliated if Edmund knew how frightened she truly is of an evening he keeps referring to, cheerfully and without a trace of anxiety himself, as simply dinner with new friends. She is, in other words, exactly what she appears to be to almost no one in that Belgravia dining room tonight. An intelligent, careful, entirely capable woman who has spent a week teaching her own hands a set of rules she was never born knowing. Because the family she is about to dine with will be reading her performance at that table as evidence of who she really is, and she understands, with a clarity that has kept her awake past midnight more than once this week, that there will be no explaining afterward if she gets it wrong. There is only the getting it right, or the getting it wrong in real time in front of witnesses. If you picture a Victorian lady dressing for a dinner party at all, you probably picture something serene, a slow, unhurried ritual of silken hairpins conducted in soft light. A woman standing patiently while deft hands arrange her into elegance the way a florist arranges a bouquet. It is a picture borrowed almost entirely from paintings and photographs, both of which show the finished result, and neither of which was ever required to show the 45 minutes that produced it. The actual process, in a household like the Hartleys, looked considerably less serene. Getting a woman into evening dress in 1885 began with a chemise, then a pair of stays laced up the back, then a corset cover, then a horsehair bustle tied at the waist to give the skirt its fashionable shelf at the back, then 2 or 3 petticoats layered over that, and only then the gown itself, which in Constance's case had to be lowered carefully over her dressed hair rather than stepped into, so as not to disturb the curls Sarah had spent the better part of an hour pinning into place. Each layer had its own set of ties, hooks, or laces, and each one had to be fastened in the correct order or the whole architecture beneath the silk would sit wrong. A fact any lady's maid worth her wages understood instinctively, and any inexperienced husband, however well-meaning, understood only in theory. The corset itself, by 1885, was a stiffened garment built around a steel busk down the front and a grid of steel or whalebone ribs sewn into channels through the fabric, laced up the back with a single long cord that had to be drawn tight in stages, from the waist outward, to avoid pinching the wearer painfully at any one point. Done well, by a practiced hand, the result gave a woman the smooth, upright silhouette the decade demanded without any particular agony attached to it. Done by an amateur working from guesswork, as Edmund Hartley was doing that evening in his own bedroom, the same garment could end up laced an inch or more tighter than intended, in exactly the way it had been laced onto Constance an hour earlier. The logic behind all of it was practical, even if the result rarely felt that way to the person wearing it. A firmly laced corset held the torso upright without effort, which mattered enormously at a table where a guest was expected to sit for 2 or 3 hours without once slouching, leaning on an elbow, or appearing to tire, since visible fatigue at dinner was, in the era's own vocabulary, a small failure of breeding. The corset did this job by doing something else at the same time, something the fashion plates never illustrated. It compressed the lower ribs and pushed the diaphragm upward, which meant that a tightly laced woman was, in a very literal physiological sense, breathing with the top third of her lungs rather than the whole of them for the entire length of the meal. Dress historians who have studied surviving garments and medical writing from the period, among them Valerie Steele, who has traced the corset's cultural and physical history in detail, have noted that this shallow, upper chest breathing was simply the ordinary condition of formal dress for most Victorian women, not a rare extreme reached only by the vain or the reckless. It also, less dramatically but just as reliably, slowed digestion, which is a detail that becomes considerably more relevant once the soup arrives. Constance, riding in a hired cab toward Belgravia with Edmund beside her, is aware of almost none of this in scientific terms, and all of it in her own body. The corset sits an inch tighter than she is used to, and she has already noticed that a full breath does not quite reach the bottom of her chest the way it usually does. Her new boots, bought specifically for the occasion and worn today for the first time, have begun to pinch sharply at the left heel, a complaint she has decided, with the particular stubbornness of a woman determined not to arrive already defeated, to simply ignore for the length of the evening. She flexes her gloved hands once in her lap, a habit she has picked up this week without quite noticing it, the same motion she used at the kitchen table while rehearsing which fork came first. Edmund, watching the street lamps past the cab window, asks her cheerfully whether she is nervous, and she tells him, quite calmly, that she is not, which is the first small performance of many she will give tonight. The living history researcher Ruth Goodman, who has spent considerable time actually wearing reconstructed Victorian corsetry rather than simply reading about it, has written candidly about how quickly the body adapts to reduced breathing and how invisible that adaptation becomes to the wearer herself after the first hour. A kind of quiet, learned endurance that a woman of Constance's era would never have thought to describe as endurance at all, since it was simply what getting dressed for the evening required. The severity varied by class in ways that mattered more than most modern retellings acknowledge. A wealthy woman with a skilled lady's maid could be laced firmly, but correctly, stage by stage, over the course of a full unhurried hour, while a woman like Constance, dressed in a rush by an amateur or by herself in front of a none too forgiving mirror, faced a real risk of being laced unevenly, too tight in one place and too loose in another, which produced more genuine discomfort for exactly the women with the least ability to correct it before the carriage arrived. There is something worth noticing in the fact that none of this discomfort was ever meant to be visible. The entire design of the evening, from the corset upward, was built to produce a woman who appeared to be sitting, breathing, and existing without the smallest effort, while every one of those things was, underneath the silk, being managed through a genuine, unremarked physical labor that began hours before the first course and would not fully end until she was home again and finally, gratefully, unlaced, now, the table itself. Because if Constance's own body was already working harder than it appeared to be, the surface she was about to sit down in front of had been built to work exactly the same way, presenting an image of easy, generous plenty over an architecture as calculated as her own corset. If you picture a formal Victorian place setting, you probably picture a slightly exaggerated version of a modern one, a few extra forks, perhaps, arranged with a bit more fuss than necessary, but fundamentally recognizable as the same basic idea. Knife, fork, spoon, more or less where you would expect to find them, just more of each. The actual layout facing a guest at the Callaway table that evening involved a good deal more specialized engineering than that comfortable picture suggests. Beyond the ordinary dinner knife and fork, a formal setting of the period commonly included a fish knife and fork, a pair the Victorians had only recently perfected, with a broad, slightly curved blade designed to lift delicate fish flesh away from its bones, without the metallic taste that an ordinary steel knife was believed to leave behind. There was an oyster fork, small and short-tined, designed specifically to work an oyster loose from its shell without the diner's fingers ever having to touch it directly. A piece of cutlery whose whole design existed to solve a problem, touching one's food, that etiquette itself had created in the first place. There were grape shears, delicate silver scissors kept beside the fruit stand so that a guest wishing to take a small bunch of grapes could snip it free of the larger bunch without laying a bare hand on fruit that other guests would also be eating from. And beside each place sat a small crescent-shaped bone dish, its only function to receive the fish bones a guest was expected to remove from the mouth as discreetly as possible, using the fork rather than the fingers, and set down without comment. None of these tools existed to make eating easier. Each one existed to prove that its owner already knew how to use it, which is a considerably different purpose, and one the tools themselves never advertised. The rule for navigating this array, at least, was simpler than the array itself. A guest worked from the outside in, course by course, trusting that whichever piece sat furthest from the plate was the one meant for whatever arrived first. Some households, including grander ones than the Callaways, laid the entire array at once so that a nervous guest faced the full accumulated weight of the evening in a single glance before a single dish had even appeared. Others sent the correct silver in with each course as it was served, removing the used pieces along with the empty plates, which spread the same test across the length of the meal instead of presenting it all at once. Either way, the message to a watching hostess was identical. A guest who reached confidently for the right piece, without pausing, without glancing sideways at anyone else's hands for guidance, had been raised to this table since childhood. A guest who hesitated, even briefly, had not. And in a room built entirely around reading exactly that kind of signal, a half-second of hesitation could tell a hostess everything she needed to know about a new acquaintance before the soup had even arrived. Decades later, some of this specialized silver would come to be seen, by a certain kind of old money commentator, as the opposite of what it was meant to signal, a fish knife in particular, eventually treated in some circles as proof that a household was trying rather too visibly to seem correct. In 1885, none of that reversal had happened yet. The fish knife was still new enough to be a point of pride rather than suspicion, and a household that owned a full, matching set of one was, for the moment, simply a household that could afford to be modern and thorough at the same time. Constance, seated a few minutes later at her assigned place, runs her eyes once, quickly, over the row of silver beside her plate, and feels something close to relief when she recognizes every single piece from her own 3 nights of kitchen table rehearsal. She does not know the word for a bone dish, exactly, but she knows precisely what the small crescent shape beside her plate is for, because she practiced with an identical one borrowed from her mother 2 nights ago. It is, she thinks, the first real good sign of the evening, though she is careful, even in the privacy of her own head, not to celebrate too soon. Behind all this specialized silver sits a story about a rapidly widening middle class and the anxiety that came with it. Households with new money, and there were more of them in London by 1885 than at any earlier point in the century, could now afford silver services as extensive as any aristocratic families, which meant that owning the correct tools was no longer, by itself, enough to prove anything. Anyone with a good silversmith and a healthy bank balance could buy a full set of grape shears. What could not be bought outright, and what the entire evening was quietly designed to test, was the unconscious, unhesitating familiarity that only came from having grown up using them, or from having practiced, in private, until the hesitation disappeared. The social historian Judith Flanders, who has written extensively on the domestic texture of Victorian daily life, has described this exact tension. A rising middle class buying its way into the material trappings of gentility, while the older establishment quietly moved the goalposts of what truly counted as belonging, always keeping the true test one step ahead of what money alone could purchase. There is something clarifying in recognizing that the 20-odd pieces of silver flanking every plate at that table were never really about the food. They were a fluent language, spoken silently and continuously throughout the meal, and every guest at the table was being scored without a single word of it ever being said aloud on how naturally they spoke it. Now, the celery, because sitting in the exact center of that table, more prominent than the candelabra flanking it, is a vegetable most modern viewers would walk straight past in a greengrocer's without a second glance. And understanding why it sat there at all changes the whole shape of the room around it. If you picture that tall glass vase at all, you probably assume it holds flowers, or perhaps that the celery inside it is simply an odd, slightly comic garnish, present for reasons no more significant than a florist's habit. A stalk of celery, after all, is not obviously the kind of object worth building a piece of dedicated glassware around. The actual reason it sat there had almost nothing to do with flavor and everything to do with the sheer difficulty of producing it. English celery, unlike the wild bitter plant it had been bred from, required deep trenches dug and refilled with rich, well-rotted manure, followed by months of a laborious process called earthing up, in which a gardener mounded soil steadily higher around the growing stalks to block out sunlight and keep them pale, tender, and sweet rather than green, tough, and sharp. Done correctly, the process took the better part of a growing season and demanded a gardener who knew precisely when to trench, when to earth up, and when the crop was ready to be lifted without having rotted in its own damp soil first. A household that could set a perfect, pale, blemish-free head of celery on its table in the depths of a London winter, or even in the more forgiving days of spring, was announcing, without a single word, that it employed the kind of skilled kitchen gardener, or could afford the kind of costly out-of-season greengrocer that most households simply could not. Celery, through most of the 19th century, was a genuine luxury vegetable, and displaying it upright and untouched in its own dedicated vessel, rather than hiding it in a soup or a sauce, was the whole point. The vase itself became its own small industry. Glassmakers on both sides of the Atlantic produced tall, footed vessels specifically shaped to hold a bundle of celery stalks upright, roots hidden, leaves fanned open at the top like a bouquet, and etiquette manuals of the period, Cassell's household guide among them, listed a celery vase as an essential piece of dinner table equipment rather than an optional flourish. Wealthier households bought theirs in heavy hand-finished cut glass, its facets catching and scattering candlelight the way a fine decanter did. Households with more modest means, and there were a great many more of these by 1885 than there had been a generation earlier, bought the same shape, produced far more cheaply in pressed glass. A technique that used a mechanical press to force molten glass into a mold rather than cutting the pattern by hand afterward, producing something that could look, to a guest across a dimly lit table, almost like the genuine article. Celery vases became a favoured wedding gift precisely because they announced, at a glance, that the newly married household intended to entertain properly. And more than a few surviving examples in museum collections today carry a couple's initials engraved into the base for exactly that reason. There is a particular, almost comic irony sitting at the centre of all this specialised silver and cut glass. And it involves the one significant exception to nearly every rule this evening has already imposed. Despite 20-odd pieces of cutlery designed expressly to keep a guest's bare fingers away from the food, celery itself was, by long custom, one of the few dishes a guest at even the most formal table was expected to eat directly with the hand, lifting a stalk from the vase, dipping it into a small private mound of salt from an individual salt cellar set at each place, and eating it exactly as one might have eaten it standing in a kitchen 100 years earlier. This is not a detail most people know, and it changes the picture considerably. In the middle of the most elaborately forked, sheared and dished meal of the century, a single vegetable was permitted to bypass the entire apparatus of Victorian dining discipline, not because anyone had grown lax about it, but because the custom of eating celery by hand predated the fork-heavy formality that had grown up around almost everything else on the table, and nobody had ever bothered to update it. Constance, when the footman brings the celery dish around during the second course, recognizes immediately that the Callaway's vase is cut glass rather than pressed, the facets throwing small, sharp points of candlelight across the white cloth in a way her mother's more modest pressed glass version at home has never quite managed. She takes a stalk, dips it into the small salt cellar set just above her plate, and eats it, for one brief course, without needing to remember a single rule about which piece of silver to use. Because for this single item, for the first time all evening, there is no piece of silver required at all. It is, if only briefly, the easiest moment of her night, and she allows herself the smallest private relief at recognizing it as one. The celery vase, in the end, is Victorian status anxiety in miniature, condensed into a single vegetable. Anyone with enough money could now buy a pressed glass imitation of a wealthy household's cut glass original, which meant that owning a celery vase at all no longer, by itself, proved very much. What still mattered, to the small and mostly unspoken degree that these things always mattered at a table like this one, was whether a guest reached for the celery with the same unhesitating ease with which they reached for the fish knife, treating the sudden absence of cutlery not as a puzzle to solve, but as simply one more rule already known by heart. A vegetable that looked, on the surface, like the evening's single moment of relaxed, informal pleasure was, underneath that surface, still quietly doing the same work as everything else on the table. For Constance, the meal now properly beginning presented a challenge that no single fork or vase could capture on its own, because what she was actually facing was not one test but 14 of them, arriving in strict, unbending order across the better part of 3 hours. If you picture a grand Victorian dinner at all, you probably picture abundance above everything else. Groaning tables, enormous joints of meat, guests eating and drinking with the hearty, unrestrained appetite the era's own reputation for excess seems to promise. 14 courses sounds, on its face, like an invitation to gluttony. The actual experience of sitting through those 14 courses was closer to the opposite. By 1885, the fashionable method of serving a formal dinner was what the trade called service la Russe, a French phrase for a style borrowed originally from Russian diplomatic tables, in which food was carved and plated out of sight in the kitchen or at a side table, then carried in and served to each guest in turn by servants working under a butler's quiet direction. One course at a time, rather than the older style in which every dish for a course sat on the table at once for guests to help themselves. The order itself followed a sequence a household like the Calloways would never have thought to explain aloud, because every guest at that level of society was assumed to already know it without being told. Soup came first, often a choice between a clear one and a thick one, followed by fish, then a run of entrees, smaller, more elaborately sauced made dishes meant to show off the kitchen's skill rather than fill a stomach, then a remove, typically a substantial roast joint carved at a side table, then game, then a sweet course of puddings or creams, then, in the most formal houses, a savoury of something salty and sharp to reset the palate, and finally dessert proper, fruit, nuts, and ices, eaten with the smallest, most delicate of the evening's silver. Each course arrived on a fresh, clean plate with fresh cutlery beside it, and each one was served in a modest, carefully controlled portion, because a servant working down a table of a dozen guests with 13 more courses still to come was never going to heap anyone's plate the way a family dinner at home might. Asking for a second helping of anything at a table like this one was almost unthinkable, and understanding why requires setting aside a modern instinct that more food is simply a compliment to the cook. In a culture where genuine hunger, real and constant, was the daily condition of a large share of the population, visible appetite at a wealthy table read as an admission that food was, for you personally, still scarce enough to matter, which was precisely the opposite of the impression a guest was meant to give. Eating slowly, taking small portions, and appearing faintly indifferent to a course you privately found delicious was not modesty for its own sake. It was proof that you had never once in your whole life needed to eat quickly for fear the food might be taken away, which was exactly the kind of proof a table like this one existed to extract from every guest seated at it. There was a cold logic to it, even if it rarely felt like logic to the people living inside it. 14 courses were not there to be consumed. They were there to be declined, gracefully, again and again, in front of witnesses keeping careful count of how gracefully you managed it. The pacing itself was controlled almost entirely by the hostess, in a mechanism most guests understood instinctively without ever having it spelled out. Servants removed a course once the hostess herself appeared to have finished with it, watching her plate rather than any individual guests, which meant that a guest eating more slowly than Mrs. Beatrice Calloway risked having a half-finished plate lifted away from under their fork before they had properly enjoyed it. Household guides of the period, including editions of Mrs. Beeton's enormously influential Book of Household Management, first published in 1861 and still sitting on the shelves of households like the Hartleys in updated printings by 1885. Offered detailed instruction on exactly this kind of orchestration, down to how many minutes a course ought to be allowed to run, and how a well-trained staff should read a hostess's smallest gesture as the signal to clear. Even Mrs. Beeton herself, writing at the height of the fashion for enormous multi-course dinners, had begun gently recommending that hostesses trim their menus down to something more manageable. And by the 1880s, a small but growing number of etiquette writers were openly arguing that 8 or 9 well-chosen courses showed better taste than 14 indifferent ones. The Calloways, in serving the full, old-fashioned 14 that evening, were making a deliberate choice. one that told their guests something about exactly how firmly the household intended to hold to the older, more demanding standard rather than bending to any newer fashion for restraint. Constance manages the whole sequence by watching, as unobtrusively as she can manage, the pace set by the woman seated 2 places to her left, a technique she devised for herself during her kitchen table rehearsals without ever having read it in any book. She takes small bites. She sets her fork down between them, as her borrowed household guide had instructed, rather than holding it upright the entire time the way she has always eaten at her own family's table. By the 9th course, a delicate sweet arriving in a small glass dish, she is, by this point, honestly hungry. Having taken only a few forkfuls of each of the 8 courses before it, and she is keenly aware that admitting this hunger, even to herself in the privacy of her own thoughts, would be considered faintly shameful by the very room she is sitting in. Her corset, laced an inch tighter than usual, is not helping matters, pressing firmly enough against her stomach that even the small portions she has taken feel, by this point in the evening, like considerably more than they are. The performance being staged at that table was, in its own way, extraordinary. A room full of well-fed, comfortable people eating carefully controlled portions of food they were perfectly capable of affording in any quantity, all of them working hard to appear as though the abundance in front of them meant almost nothing at all. The machinery required to produce that performance, the timed courses, the servants trained to read a single woman's fork, the small individual portions calculated precisely to leave every guest slightly, deliberately unsatisfied, was considerably less glamorous than the impression it was built to create. Judith Flanders has described this exact contradiction at the heart of Victorian dining, an era famous for its excess that in practice policed appetite, at least at the formal table, more strictly than almost any decade before or since. The food was abundant. The eating of it was not meant to be. A woman like Constance, hungry and a little light-headed by the 9th course of 14, was experiencing exactly the outcome the whole system had been engineered to produce, not an accident of poor planning, but the entire, carefully calculated point of the evening. Nobody at that table in April of 1885 had any particular reason to fear the food arriving in front of them, and in the strictest sense, they were mostly right not to. But 2 of the evening's most ordinary pleasures, the china the food sat on and the oysters that opened the meal, carried risks that neither science nor custom had yet fully reckoned with. And neither risk had anything to do with how carefully a guest handled a fork. The china itself, at a household as prosperous as the Calloways, was almost certainly fine bone porcelain, thin, pale, and expensive enough that its glaze posed little practical danger to the people eating from it. The greater hazard sat 1 or 2 social rungs further down, in the cheaper, mass-produced earthenware that filled the dressers of households like the Hartleys and countless others across London, decorated with the bright blue transferware patterns the century had made enormously fashionable and finished with a lead glaze because lead, added to the glassy coating fired onto a piece of pottery, made it smoother, glossier, and considerably cheaper to produce than the alternatives. That glaze, when it came into repeated contact with acidic foods, vinegar dressings, fruit, even the wine served alongside dinner, could leach small amounts of lead directly into what a family ate. A slow, cumulative exposure entirely invisible to the people absorbing it. The gravest, most immediately documented danger fell not on diners at all, but on the workers who applied that glaze for a living. In the pottery towns of Staffordshire, where a recognized occupational illness researchers today call plumbism, and factory hands of the period simply called potter's rot, produced colic, paralysis of the wrists, and a slow wasting that doctors had been describing in medical literature since well before the middle of the century. It would not be until 1895, a decade after the Calloways' dinner, that a new factory act finally required doctors to report cases of industrial lead poisoning by name, forcing a problem that had been documented for decades into something resembling official record. For a family eating off cheap, pretty blue and white china every single night of the year rather than only handling the glaze in a workshop. The exposure was smaller and slower, but the underlying chemistry was exactly the same substance, quietly doing a smaller version of the same damage in a very different room. The oysters carried a different kind of hidden risk entirely, and one bound up with London's own rapid, uncontrolled growth. Oysters, in 1885, were not yet the rare luxury they would become within a generation. They were common enough and cheap enough that Charles Dickens, writing half a century earlier in the Pickwick Papers, had put into the mouth of his character Sam Weller the observation that poverty and oysters seemed to go together, since the poorest London streets always seemed to have the greatest number of oyster stalls. By the time the Calloways served their opening course of oysters on ice, that abundance was already beginning to change, as demand outpaced the natural beds and dredging pushed further and further afield to keep pace with fashionable London's appetite. But oysters still sat on tables across a fairly wide span of English society, not only the grandest ones. What almost nobody eating them in 1885 understood was that some of the beds supplying London's oyster stalls and dinner tables sat uncomfortably close to the outflow of the very sewers a rapidly growing city was pouring into its rivers and estuaries, and that oysters, filtering enormous volumes of water through their bodies as they feed, could concentrate whatever pathogens happened to be suspended in that water, including the bacterium responsible for typhoid fever. Physicians of the period were only just beginning to notice a pattern connecting scattered outbreaks of the disease to shellfish from particular beds, a suspicion that would take years more to harden into anything resembling proof. It would be 1902, 17 years after this particular dinner, before the danger became undeniable to the wider public, when an outbreak traced to oysters harvested near Emsworth, in Hampshire, killed several guests at a formal banquet, including the Dean of Winchester, and finally forced the connection between raw shellfish and sewage-borne disease into every newspaper in the country. None of this touches Constance directly, not that evening, and not, as far as she will ever know, at any point afterward. She eats her allotted portion of oysters with the small, sharp-tined fork she practiced with at her mother's borrowed place setting, finds them pleasant rather than remarkable, and moves on to the soup without a second thought, exactly as every other guest at that table does. The danger sitting quietly inside both the china and the shellfish that evening was invisible not because anyone was hiding it, but because the science required to see it clearly had not yet caught up with the century's own appetite for cheap glaze and abundant seafood, and would not fully catch up for years. A meal so thoroughly engineered to expose every social flaw a guest might carry was, at the exact same moment, sitting on top of physical risks nobody in that dining room had the tools to detect at all. The evening had a great deal to say about which fork revealed a person's upbringing. It had nothing at all to say about which plate might, slowly and invisibly, be doing them harm. Which brings us to a rule of conversation nobody at that table would have described as a rule at all, because by 1885 it had stopped feeling like an instruction and had simply become the invisible shape conversation was expected to take, governed entirely by a single woman who never once had to raise her voice to enforce it. The custom was called, informally, turning the table, and it worked on a simple but rigid principle. When guests first sat down, each lady was expected to give her attention primarily to the gentleman who had escorted her into dinner, seated on one side of her, while conversation around the table generally flowed toward the hostess's chosen direction, often to her left as the meal began. At a signal understood rather than announced, typically when a new course arrived, the hostess would turn her own attention to the guest on her opposite side, and the rest of the table, watching her without appearing to watch her, would turn with her, each guest shifting from the person they had been speaking to toward whoever sat on their other side. A gentleman who had spent the soup course deep in conversation with the lady on his right was expected, once the table turned, to direct his attention smoothly to the lady on his left, regardless of whether the first conversation had reached anything resembling a natural close. Etiquette writers of the period were explicit that a lady should distribute her conversational graces evenly, engaging the guests on both sides across the length of the meal rather than monopolizing one companion for the whole evening, no matter how agreeable he might prove to be. The content of that conversation was governed just as tightly as its direction. The accepted tone was light, easy, and faintly playful, steering well clear of anything that might produce real disagreement. Politics, religion, personal finance, illness, and anything resembling gossip about people known to the room were all, by the standards of household guides and etiquette columns of the day, subjects a well-bred guest simply did not raise at a dinner table, no matter how naturally they might have arisen in any other setting. The goal was not intimacy. It was a kind of pleasant, frictionless surface, maintained by everyone at once, in which nobody's evening was disturbed by a topic they had not chosen to discuss. What made this arrangement so difficult, rather than merely quaint, was the constant, low-grade vigilance it demanded of every single guest for the entire length of the meal. A guest had to track not only their own conversation, but the hostess's posture and attention several places away, ready to redirect their own words the moment she redirected hers, without ever appearing to watch for the cue at all. Missing the turn, continuing a private conversation a beat too long after the rest of the table had already shifted, marked a guest as either inattentive or, worse, as someone so consumed by their own conversation that they had forgotten the room existed around them. Turning too early, before the hostess herself had turned, carried its own smaller risk of seeming presumptuous, as though a guest imagined they controlled the rhythm of a table that was never theirs to control in the first place. Constance spends the earlier courses seated between two men she has never met before this evening. A shipping agent on her right who talks pleasantly and at some length about a recent voyage his firm insured, and a quieter, older gentleman on her left whom she has barely addressed at all. She watches Mrs. Calloway from the corner of her eye without once turning her head fully in that direction, and when the hostess shifts her attention partway through the fish course, Constance turns toward the quiet gentleman on her left with what she hopes reads as natural, unforced interest rather than the carefully timed maneuver it actually is. She very nearly asks him, in the first moment of that new conversation, what business had brought him into acquaintance with the Calloways, a perfectly ordinary question by the standards of her own family's dinner table, and a faintly indelicate one by the standards of this room, where a guest's trade or income was understood to be a subject one simply did not raise directly. She catches herself a half-second before the words leave her mouth and asks instead, with what she hopes is convincing ease, whether he has been to the opera this season, a question that costs her nothing and reveals nothing, which is, she is beginning to understand, precisely the point of nearly everything said at this table tonight. What this constant, quiet redirection really describes is authority exercised so completely that it never needed to announce itself. Mrs. Calloway did not instruct a single guest where to direct their attention over the course of the evening, and yet every guest at that table adjusted their conversation to her rhythm all night long. An entire room's worth of social behavior conducted by a woman who never raised her voice above the ordinary pitch of dinner conversation. Social historians who have studied the domestic authority of the Victorian hostess, Judith Flanders among them, have noted how thoroughly this kind of control depended on guests already knowing the rules well enough to follow them without instruction, which meant that the system rewarded exactly the guests who needed the least explanation and quietly exposed exactly the guests, like Constance, who were still learning the shape of the room by careful observation rather than by lifelong habit. What that constant vigilance actually cost the people performing it rarely showed. A dinner that looked, from across the room, like easy and effortless conversation among comfortable friends was, for at least one guest at that table, a continuous exercise in watching, timing, and self-correction that left almost no room for the evening to feel like pleasure at all. By the sixth course, something had begun to change in the room that had nothing to do with the food arriving at it. The gas jets along the walls burning steadily for hours now, had warmed the air considerably beyond where it had started, and a dozen bodies seated close together in evening dress, none of them able to loosen so much as a single button without drawing every eye at the table, had warmed it further still. Heavy curtains drawn against the spring evening held that warmth in rather than letting it out, and the candles on the table itself, burning down steadily, added their own small, cumulative share of heat to a room that had been built for elegance rather than ventilation. For most of the men present, in tailcoats and starched collars that pressed uncomfortably against the throat but left the torso and lungs largely free to work as they were meant to, the heat was an annoyance rather than a genuine strain. For the women, laced into corsets that had already been compressing their ribs and shortening their breath since before the carriage arrived, the combination of that same heat with hours of restricted breathing produced something closer to a real physical ordeal, one no guest at the table would have dreamed of naming aloud. A tightly laced woman, breathing shallowly from the top of her chest for the length of an already warm evening, faced a genuine and recognized risk of faintness. And the risk was common enough that fashionable ladies routinely carried small decorative bottles called vinaigrettes in their reticules, fitted with a perforated inner lid over a sponge soaked in aromatic vinegar, to be pressed briefly to the nose at the first sign of dizziness. A well-run household of the Calloways standing kept its own countermeasures ready as a matter of course. A quiet side room near the dining room, with smelling salts and a chair to hand, staffed by a housemaid who understood, without needing to be told twice in an evening, exactly what a lady's sudden pallor and a murmured excuse usually meant. Constance feels the heat first as a faint dampness at the back of her neck, then as a specific, familiar tightness across her ribs that she recognizes from the carriage ride over. Now considerably worse after 2 hours of sitting perfectly upright without once allowing her back to touch the chair. She has been taught, the way every woman of her class has been taught, that a lady does not fan herself too visibly at table and does not, under almost any circumstance, ask to step outside for air unless the alternative is genuinely fainting in front of 12 witnesses. She manages the discomfort the only way available to her, by breathing as evenly and shallowly as her stays will permit, by keeping her spine held a careful half-inch off the back of the chair the way she was taught as a girl, and by quietly, deliberately not thinking about how much longer the meal has left to run. It is, she will reflect much later that night, the single hardest piece of the whole evening to perform, harder than any fork. Precisely because nobody was watching for it, and nobody would have thought to sympathize if they had noticed. Dress historians have only fully reconstructed this particular kind of suffering by doing what Constance herself was doing that evening, actually wearing the garments in question for hours at a stretch rather than examining them behind museum glass. The living history researcher Ruth Goodman has written about how completely this kind of shallow, restricted breathing became the ordinary, unremarked baseline of a formal evening for Victorian women, adapted to so thoroughly that a woman rarely thought to describe it as suffering at all. In much the same way a person does not spend an evening consciously narrating the fact that their shoes are a size too small. The severity, once again, tracked closely with money and household size. A woman with a skilled lady's maid could be laced firmly but evenly in a corset properly fitted to her own figure rather than to a dressmaker's general pattern, while a woman managing her own toilet or relying on an inexperienced husband's unpracticed hands faced a meaningfully higher risk of exactly the uneven, badly distributed pressure Constance was quietly enduring at that moment. An entire room full of comfortable, well-fed people, dining in a house built to advertise ease and abundance, contained at least half its guests engaged in a real, sustained physical effort simply to keep breathing evenly enough to avoid disgracing themselves in front of the other half. The performance of effortlessness that the whole evening depended on required, for the women seated at that table, a considerable and entirely invisible expenditure of actual physical effort, sustained silently, course after course, for as long as the meal demanded it of them. For Constance, the moment when Mrs. Calloway finally rose from her chair carried its own particular anxiety, one that had nothing to do with forks or silver at all. Dessert had been cleared, the last of the nuts and fruit picked over, and the hostess caught the eye of each lady at the table in turn, a small, practiced signal that meant it was time for the women to withdraw and leave the men to their port. The ritual that followed was as fixed as anything that had come before it. The ladies rose together, gathered their skirts, and moved through to the drawing room, where coffee waited and where the strict, formal choreography of the dining table finally, visibly relaxed. The gentlemen remained behind at the table, where a fresh decanter of port was set in motion, walnuts were cracked, and cigars were lit, the smoke and the specific vocabulary of that conversation. Business, politics, occasionally something considerably closer to bawdy than anything permitted at the mixed table an hour earlier, understood by everyone in the house to belong exclusively to that room for as long as the men chose to remain in it. The separation was not a matter of taste so much as a matter of design. A dinner table with both sexes present had to maintain the careful, frictionless conversation the whole evening had already demanded. A dining room with only men in it was permitted, by long and unquestioned custom, to become something rather less careful for the 20 or 30 minutes the arrangement typically lasted. The drawing room, meanwhile, offered its own kind of relief and its own kind of danger, in roughly equal measure. Away from the men, and away from the rigid structure of the table itself, the ladies' conversation loosened considerably, drifting toward exactly the subjects the dinner table had spent 3 hours forbidding: a daughter's prospects, a mutual acquaintance's questionable new bonnet. A whispered aside about which guest at that very table had seemed a little unsure of herself tonight. Constance understood, sitting with a cup of coffee she barely tasted, that this room was where the evening's actual verdict was being quietly assembled, in fragments, well before anyone had left the house. She caught, without meaning to, a soft exchange between two women near the window concerning a young wife who had, at a dinner the previous month, apparently reached for the wrong spoon during the soup course and never quite recovered her footing in that particular circle afterward. Nobody mentioned Constance by name in her hearing. She spent the better part of 20 minutes acutely aware that she might easily have been the subject of an identical exchange at some other dinner, in some other drawing room, without ever knowing it had happened. When the gentlemen eventually rejoined the ladies, smelling faintly of cigar smoke and considerably more relaxed than they had been at the table, the evening softened further into music and unhurried conversation before the first guests began, discreetly, to call for their carriages. By the standards of the room, it had been, on the whole, an unremarkable and perfectly pleasant evening, which was, for a guest in Constance's position, close to the very best outcome available. Nothing about it had been memorable in any specific way. Nobody had needed to remember her at all. And for one evening, that quiet, uneventful invisibility was itself a genuine, hard-won accomplishment. This separation of the sexes was really a household managing two very different audiences with two very different sets of rules, each carefully contained within its own room and its own portion of the evening. Judith Flanders has written about how thoroughly Victorian domestic architecture itself, the placement of the dining room relative to the drawing room, the doors positioned to allow exactly this kind of orderly withdrawal, was built around social rituals like this one. The house itself functioning as a kind of stage machinery for performances its own architects had never needed to see performed, to understand. The women's retreat to the drawing room was framed, on its surface, as delicacy, sparing female company from masculine vice. In practice, it also created the one space in the entire evening where the evening itself could be discussed, assessed, and quietly filed away for future reference, well before any guest had reached the safety of their own front door. The dinner itself, exhausting as it was, turned out to be only half of the ordeal. The other half arrived the following morning, in a city that had built an entire quiet infrastructure for discussing exactly what had happened at a table like the Calloways the night before, and for deciding, in fragments and murmurs, over subsequent days. What any small stumble at that table was actually going to cost the person who made it. London society of the 1880s ran on a dense, overlapping network of morning calls, calling cards left at a household's door, notes exchanged between women who might not see one another in person for weeks, and servants who moved between houses carrying gossip as readily as they carried messages. A guest's performance at dinner did not end when the carriage pulled away from the Calloway's door. It continued to circulate for days afterward, discussed at other women's morning calls, mentioned in passing at other tables, refined and repeated until a single moment of hesitation over a fish knife could, by the end of a week, have hardened into a settled and widely shared opinion about a family's fitness for a particular circle. Nothing about this process was official. Nobody wrote a report or issued a verdict. It simply accumulated, quietly, the way water finds its level, until everyone who mattered in a given social world had arrived, independently, at more or less the same conclusion. The most severe consequence available within that world, reserved for genuine and serious breaches rather than a single missed fork, was a practice everyone in Constance's position understood by reputation, even if they had never personally witnessed it delivered. It was called the cut, and in its most complete form, the cut direct. It involved looking a former acquaintance directly in the face in a public place and giving no sign whatsoever of recognizing them. A deliberate, unmistakable act of social erasure performed in front of any witnesses who happened to be present. Etiquette writers of the period described several gentler variations available to a person who wished to withdraw from an acquaintance without quite so brutal a public statement. The cut modest, in which the offending party simply looked away rather than meeting the other person's eye. And the cut sublime, in which the cutter gazed fixedly at the sky until the unwanted acquaintance had passed by. The rules governing who could deliver a cut and to whom were almost as rigid as the rules governing the dinner table itself. A gentleman, by the accepted code of the day, was never to cut a lady under any circumstance, regardless of what she had done, which meant the weapon itself was distributed along exactly the same lines of power that shaped everything else in this world. Etiquette manuals of the period generally counseled restraint even here, warning that so severe and public a statement should be reserved for genuine offences, and suggesting that a quieter, gradual withdrawal of attention usually served a household's purposes just as effectively, with considerably less risk of the ugly public scene a full cut direct could provoke. For Constance and Edmund, the stakes riding on that single evening were smaller than a full public cut, and, in a sense, more immediately practical. Edmund's new position depended on the Calloway family's continued goodwill toward his firm, a fragile professional relationship still measured in months rather than years, and a wife who embarrassed herself badly enough at a first dinner could colour a hostess's private opinion of her husband for a considerably longer time than either of them would ever be told directly. Nothing so dramatic as a cut was ever likely to follow a single evening of careful, competent behaviour. What was at stake, more quietly and more realistically, was simply whether a second invitation would ever arrive at all. Whether the Hartleys would be folded gradually into this circle or allowed, just as gradually and just as silently, to drift back out of it, with no single moment anyone could point to as the cause. As it happened, Constance's evening had gone, by any honest measure, rather well. She had reached for the correct fork every time, without visible hesitation. She had turned with the table when Mrs. Calloway turned it, more or less on schedule. She had said nothing indelicate, admired nothing too effusively, and eaten just enough of each of the 14 courses to appear neither greedy nor ungrateful. In the carriage home, Edmund remarks cheerfully that he thought the whole evening went off very pleasantly. Entirely unaware of the 3 careful nights of rehearsal at the kitchen table that had made his own casual ease possible, or of exactly how much concentration his wife had spent. Course after course, simply appearing as effortless as he assumed the whole thing naturally was for her. Constance agrees that it was a pleasant evening, and says nothing further about it, because there is, in the end, no way to explain to him what the evening actually cost her, without also explaining that she had spent the better part of a week afraid of it. It is well past midnight by the time they reach their own house, and Sarah, roused from bed, helps Constance out of her gown, and finally, blessedly, out of the corset that has been laced an inch too tight since 4 o'clock that afternoon. The relief of that first full breath, drawn without a single steel rib pressing back against it, is, in its own small way, the most honest sensation Constance has experienced since she first stood in front of her own mirror that evening. Nobody at the Calloways' table saw this moment, and nobody was ever meant to. It belonged entirely to her, the one part of the whole long evening that required no performance at all. There is something clarifying in recognizing what an evening like this one was actually built to accomplish, and it was never really about the food. Judith Flanders has argued that the elaborate machinery of Victorian formal dining functioned, above almost everything else, as a sorting mechanism for a rapidly changing society, a way of quietly separating the people who truly belonged from the people merely trying to look as though they did. At a moment in the century when new money was arriving faster than the old order could comfortably absorb it, every fork, every turn of the table, every carefully calculated portion of food was doing the same underlying work, testing not whether a guest could eat a meal, which almost anyone could manage perfectly well, but whether they could perform the specific, arbitrary, and constantly shifting choreography that had been agreed, by nobody in particular, to separate one class from another. Constance passed her own test that night. She would spend a great many more evenings, in the years ahead, discovering exactly how often the test would be given again. There is one part of that evening we have not yet gone back for, and it happened before Constance ever sat down at the table at all, in the 10 minutes after her carriage arrived, in a front hall crowded with guests who all, without exception, already knew something about the evening that nobody had troubled to explain to her directly. The problem Mrs. Calloway had solved earlier that week, quietly and without any of her guests ever seeing the work involved, was the question of precedence, deciding which gentleman would escort which lady in to dinner and in what order the resulting pairs would process from the drawing-room to the table. This was not a casual matter of convenience, pairing off whoever happened to be standing near one another when the meal was announced. It was a small, exacting exercise in social mathematics, and a hostess entertaining guests whose relative rank was not already obvious to her sometimes consulted a reference volume like Debrett's or Burke's, the standard printed guides to the peerage and landed gentry, to settle a question her own memory could not answer with confidence. Where two guests held no formal title to distinguish them, the accepted rules fell back on simpler measures, a married lady outranking an unmarried one, an older guest outranking a younger one of otherwise equal standing, small distinctions that nonetheless had to be gotten right, because a hostess who paired her guests carelessly risked a silent but very real offence to someone who had, in that moment, been quietly and publicly ranked beneath where they believed themselves to stand. Once Mrs. Calloway had settled the question to her own satisfaction, each gentleman was informed, quietly, before dinner was announced, exactly which lady he was to escort to the table, so that when the moment finally arrived, the whole room could process from the drawing-room to the dining-room in a single, unbroken line, arranged from the most honoured guest to the least, without a single visible hesitation or awkward pause at the door. The master of the house offered his own arm to the lady judged most distinguished among the guests present. The most distinguished gentleman present offered his arm to the lady of the house. Every other pairing fell into place behind them according to the same quiet calculation, and the hostess herself, along with whichever gentleman had been assigned to escort her, always left the drawing-room last, since it was understood to be her particular duty to see every other guest safely on their way to the table before she considered her own comfort. Constance had been informed, a few minutes after arriving, that she would be escorted in by a Mr. Grantley, a barrister of moderate standing whom she had never met before that evening, and the two of them had taken their place well back in the procession, neither first nor last, a position she recognized with a small and specific relief, as exactly where a solicitor's wife of no particular family and no particular fortune ought reasonably to expect to stand in a room like this one. Being placed too near the front would have meant an attention she was entirely unprepared to manage. Being placed at the very back, last through the door, would have told her, just as clearly and just as silently, that she and Edmund ranked beneath every other guest in the house that night. The middle of the line, unremarkable and unremarked upon, was, for a guest still learning the shape of this particular world, the single most comfortable place she could have hoped to occupy. Her seat at the table, once she reached it, confirmed the same quiet arithmetic. She sat a comfortable, unremarkable distance from Mrs. Calloway's own chair at the head of the table, close enough to have been placed with some care, and far enough that nobody watching the seating plan would read anything particular into her position at all. The whole arrangement, precedence, escort, and seat alike, had been decided entirely without her knowledge or her input in the days before she ever stepped into that front hall, and yet it shaped, more thoroughly than anything she herself would do over the following 3 hours, exactly how the room understood who she was before she had spoken a single word to anyone in it. This careful, invisible sorting was the product of a society that had, over generations, built an entire discipline out of ranking people precisely enough to seat them correctly at dinner. A discipline so refined that guidebooks existed specifically to settle disputes a hostess's own judgment could not resolve alone. What made the practice so quietly effective as a tool of social discipline was exactly how little it required anyone to say out loud. Nobody at that dinner ever announced where Constance ranked relative to the other guests in the room. She simply walked through a door in a particular order, sat in a particular chair, and understood without a single word needing to be spoken. Precisely where she stood, a lesson delivered entirely through architecture and sequence rather than through anything resembling conversation. Constance's whole evening had, in a real sense, already been decided before she arrived, by a woman she had not yet properly met, working from a private calculation Constance would never see, and could not have appealed even if she had wanted to. The test she believed herself to be sitting, fork by fork and course by course, had actually begun several minutes earlier, at a doorway, in a line she had not chosen the order of and could not have rearranged even had she understood, in that moment, that it was being arranged at all. None of what happened at that table could have happened at all without a second, entirely separate performance taking place at the same time, 2 floors below, in a kitchen none of the evening's guests would ever see and few of them would think to ask about. Producing 14 courses, each one plated individually and timed to arrive at the table in a precise, unbroken sequence, required a household staff considerably larger and more specialized than the elegant simplicity of the dining room ever let on. A house on the scale of the Calloways typically employed a cook, quite possibly a chef trained in the French style. Since a household wealthy enough to keep a proper chef rather than simply a competent cook was making its own quiet statement about the seriousness with which it took its table alongside one or more kitchen maids to handle the endless chopping, plucking and washing that any dish required before it ever reached the range. A scullery maid lower still in the household hierarchy, responsible for the pots, the greasy roasting pans, and the coal-blackened grates nobody upstairs ever had to think about, and a butler whose job, among many others, was to stand at the dining room door reading the hostess's smallest gesture and translating it, silently, into instructions for the footman carrying each course up from the kitchen below. The range itself burned coal continuously for hours before the first guest arrived, requiring near constant attention to keep its heat steady enough for delicate sauces while still hot enough to roast a joint of meat. And without any mechanical refrigeration to rely on, perishable ingredients like fish and cream depended on a household's own ice supply, delivered in blocks and stored in a well-run house, in a dedicated ice safe that had to be managed just as carefully as the fire. timing 14 separate courses to arrive at the correct moment, hot when they needed to be hot, and composed when they needed to look composed, without any of the guests upstairs ever glimpsing the frantic coordination required to make it happen, was its own considerable feat of household management, one that depended entirely on a cook and a butler working in close, practiced communication, often across 2 full flights of stairs. A dish that arrived even a few minutes early risked going cold or losing its careful presentation while it waited. A dish that arrived late risked disrupting the entire rhythm of the meal. The delicate business of turning the table and pacing conversation that depended on courses appearing and disappearing at a predictable interval. The women, and less commonly, the men managing this timing from below stairs, were, in every meaningful sense, running the evening every bit as much as Mrs. Calloway was running it from her chair at the head of the table, and their reward for doing it well was, almost by definition, that nobody upstairs noticed they had done anything at all. Constance, watching a footman carry away her nearly untouched dessert plate that evening, has no particular reason to think about the kitchen producing it. Beyond a fleeting, half-formed awareness that a meal this large clearly required more hands than her own household could ever muster. At home, in the Hartleys' considerably smaller establishment, Sarah alone manages the cooking, the cleaning, and most of the household's daily labour, a single pair of hands doing work that, in a house like the Calloways, would have been divided among 6 specialists. Constance has, on more than one ordinary evening, stood in her own small kitchen, helping Sarah finish a simple family supper, and something in the sheer, choreographed scale of the meal she has just eaten leaves her, on the ride home, unexpectedly moved by a thought she cannot quite put into words at the time. A recognition that the ease she experienced tonight as a guest was purchased with a volume of unseen labour that her own household, no matter how hard Sarah worked, had never come close to matching. Social historians have had to reconstruct this invisible labour, largely from the rare surviving records left by the servants themselves, since most left no written trace of their working lives at all. Judith Flanders has drawn heavily, in her own research into Victorian domestic life, on the diary of a real domestic servant named Hannah Culwick, whose detailed, unusually candid daily entries give historians one of the few genuinely intimate views into exactly what running a household of this kind actually demanded, hour by hour, from the women who made it possible. What emerges from records like hers is a picture sharply at odds with the serene, effortless abundance the dining room itself was built to project. A kitchen running at something close to its physical limit for most of a working day, so that 12 people upstairs could experience an evening that appeared to require no effort whatsoever. The entire performance playing out at the Calloways' table, the 14 courses, the precisely timed service, the food arriving exactly when the choreography of the evening required it, depended on a second performance happening at the same time, one considerably more physically demanding and considerably less admired, conducted by people whose names none of that evening's guests would ever think to learn. Even before Constance walked through the Calloways' front door, the evening had already cost the Hartley household a sum neither of them would have mentioned aloud to anyone outside their own bedroom. And understanding that cost changes the picture of the whole evening rather considerably. The dove-grey silk gown had been made specially for the occasion by a dressmaker Constance's mother recommended, at a price that represented a considerable fraction of what Edmund's new still modest salary as a junior partner brought in over a full month. New evening gloves were required alongside it, since a lady's gloves at a formal dinner were expected to appear immaculate, without a single visible mark or stretch mark at the seam, a standard that made reusing a pair from an earlier season a real and recognizable risk rather than an economy. Sarah's evening spent dressing Constance's hair, though it cost the household nothing beyond her own considerable time and effort, meant that the ordinary work of the house had gone undone for most of that day, a debt of tasks Sarah would be repaying for the rest of the week. Because the Hartleys kept no carriage of their own, the specific mark of settled wealth that a family like the Calloways took entirely for granted, Edmund had hired a cab for the evening, and both of them were keenly aware arriving at the Calloways' door just as another family's private carriage pulled away from it. Coachman and footman both in matching livery. Exactly what that small, unavoidable difference in arrival announced to anyone watching from the front steps. None of this expense was frivolous. Exactly. Even if it might have looked that way to an outside observer measuring only the cost against the calories eventually consumed. Edmund's new position depended, in ways neither of them would ever have stated so bluntly to each other, on being seen by the Calloways and their circle as a family capable of moving comfortably in this world, and a solicitor whose wife arrived underdressed, or whose own evening clothes showed signs of careful, repeated mending, risked quietly undermining the very professional advancement the dinner itself was meant to secure. The historian Catherine Hughes, who has written extensively about the pressures facing aspirational middle-class households of exactly this period, has described how thoroughly a family's visible consumption, a new gown, a hired hairdresser, the right kind of carriage, or the right kind of excuse for not having one, functioned as a form of professional credential in its own right, every bit as consequential to a man's career as his actual competence at his desk. A single evening's appearance of effortless comfort was, in practice, the product of careful and sometimes painful calculation about exactly where a limited household budget could be stretched and where it could not. Constance manages the arithmetic of all this quietly, in the part of her mind she has learned, over 11 years of marriage to a man building a career one careful step at a time, to keep entirely separate from the smiling, unhurried face she presents at the Calloways' table. She has already decided, without discussing it with Edmund, that her new grey silk will need to serve for at least 2 further engagements this season before either of them will feel able to justify another dressmaker's bill, a private economy she has no intention of mentioning to anyone in that dining room, where every other lady present would assume, without a second thought, that a gown this fine was simply one of several equally fine gowns hanging in her wardrobe at home. This careful, invisible household economy was common across a rapidly expanding professional middle-class living in a great many households across London, closer to the edge of its own visible comfort than any dinner table of the period would ever let a guest suspect. Judith Flanders has documented just how common this particular kind of strain became as the century wore on, families with entirely respectable incomes nonetheless stretching themselves thin to maintain a standard of entertaining and dress that the oldest, wealthiest families in the room could produce without a second thought, precisely because the whole system was built to reward the appearance of effortless plenty and to punish, quietly but unmistakably, any visible sign that plenty had required effort at all. The ease radiating from that dinner table, the unhurried courses, the fine silk, the casual assumption that of course everyone present could simply afford an evening like this one, was, for at least one couple in that room, the product of a careful, private calculation conducted at their own kitchen table days earlier. A calculation none of their fellow guests would ever be permitted to see. The 4 crystal glasses standing at every place that evening, admired earlier simply as part of the table's general gleam, turned out to carry their own quiet set of expectations, ones that had nothing to do with taste and everything to do with timing. Formal Victorian dinners of this kind generally matched a particular wine to a particular course, following a sequence. Guests of Constance's world were assumed to have absorbed by long familiarity rather than by any single rule anyone had ever explained to them directly. A light sherry typically accompanied the soup. A white wine such as hock arrived with the fish. Claret was poured somewhere through the run of entrees and the roast, and champagne, saved for the sweet course, provided the evening's single moment of deliberate, sanctioned indulgence. None of this was announced. A footman simply moved down the table with each new bottle at the appropriate point in the meal, filling glasses in careful order, and a guest was expected to understand, without being told, which of the 4 glasses in front of them was meant to receive whichever wine had just arrived. A guest did not pour their own wine at a table like this one, and asking a footman directly for more of a particular vintage once it had already been poured and cleared carried a faint suggestion of overindulgence that a well-bred guest was assumed to avoid entirely. A guest who wished to decline a wine altogether, whether from temperance conviction, a delicate constitution, or simple preference, had a small, wordless way of managing it that etiquette writers of the period described approvingly, resting 2 fingers lightly across the rim of the glass as the footman approached. A discreet signal that required no spoken refusal and drew no particular attention from anyone else at the table. The gesture mattered because a spoken refusal, no matter how politely phrased, risked drawing exactly the kind of notice a guest at this table was trying, in every other respect, to avoid. Toasts added their own small layer of calculation to an already crowded evening. A formal toast, proposed by the host or by a particularly honored guest, required every other guest to raise a glass and drink in acknowledgement, though the amount actually swallowed mattered considerably less than the visible gesture of participation itself, and a guest wishing to avoid drinking deeply could satisfy the custom with the smallest, most token sip without anyone at the table thinking to remark on it. Refusing to participate in a toast at all, by contrast, was a far more serious matter, a visible, public withholding of goodwill toward whatever person or occasion the toast had honored, and etiquette manuals of the period treated the distinction between drinking sparingly and declining to drink altogether as considerably more consequential than the actual quantity of wine involved in either choice. By 1885, this whole elaborate wine service was beginning to sit somewhat uneasily alongside a growing and increasingly respectable temperance movement, one that had already persuaded a meaningful number of middle-class households, including some Constance herself knew personally, to serve no wine at their own tables at all. The Calloways, older money and older habits, showed no sign of moving in that direction, and Constance, who drinks moderately at her own family's table but has no particular attachment to wine one way or another, spends a portion of the meal quietly watching how much or how little the other women around her actually drink before deciding, course by course, how to calibrate her own glass to match the room rather than her own preference. She accepts the sherry, sips the hock without finishing it, takes rather less of the claret than is poured for her, and lifts her champagne dutifully when a brief, informal toast is offered partway through the sweet course, touching the glass to her lips without truly drinking from it. A small, careful performance layered on top of every other performance the evening has already demanded of her. This particular set of rules reflected a fashionable society trying to hold 2 increasingly incompatible ideas at once: a long-standing tradition of wine as an essential mark of proper hospitality, and a newer, growing cultural suspicion of visible drinking that the temperance movement had, by the 1880s, made respectable enough to require careful management even in households with no intention of abandoning wine altogether. The 2-fingered gesture across a glass, small and nearly invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it, allowed both instincts to coexist at the same table without either one having to be spoken aloud, which was, in its own modest way, exactly the kind of quiet mechanical solution this whole evening specialized in producing. Even the simple act of declining a drink required its own small, rehearsed piece of choreography, one more silent signal in an evening that had, by this point, turned nearly every ordinary human gesture, eating, drinking, speaking, even sitting still, into something requiring careful, conscious management beyond the forks, the vase, the wine, and the careful choreography of who spoke to whom. The evening was studded with a great many smaller rules, individually minor, collectively exhausting, each one small enough to seem hardly worth mentioning, and each one, in its own way, just as capable of marking a guest as unfamiliar with the room. The napkin itself carried its own small etiquette. It was to be lifted from the table and laid across the lap as soon as a guest sat down, never tucked into a collar or shirt front the way a child or, worse, a workman at a public house might handle one. A gesture that etiquette writers of the period treated as an unmistakable mark of low breeding wherever it appeared. At the close of the meal, A guest at a formal dinner was expected to leave the napkin loosely gathered on the table rather than folding it back into a neat, careful square, since a napkin refolded too precisely suggested a guest more accustomed to economizing on household linen than to the effortless abundance a house like the Callaways took for granted. Bread, when it appeared, was broken into small pieces with the fingers rather than cut with a knife or bitten directly from the roll, and butter was applied only to the single small piece about to be eaten, never spread across an entire slice or roll in advance, a habit considered faintly greedy, as though a guest were preparing for more bread than good manners technically allowed them to want. Soup was taken from the side of the spoon rather than the tip, moved away from the body rather than toward it as it was lifted from the bowl, and a guest was never to tip the bowl itself to chase the last few spoonfuls, no matter how good the soup, since a nearly empty bowl was simply left nearly empty rather than pursued to the last drop. Posture carried its own continuous demands, quieter than any single rule about cutlery but no less closely watched. Elbows stayed off the table throughout the meal. The back remained a careful distance from the chair rather than slumped against it, and a guest was expected to keep both hands visible and occupied rather than resting one idly in the lap for any extended stretch. A habit some etiquette writers considered almost as telling as an outright mistake with a fork. Talking with food still in the mouth was, of course, forbidden outright, but so, more subtly, was gesturing with a knife or fork while making a point in conversation. A habit considered faintly threatening in its origin and simply undignified by 1885. Whatever its distant history, and at the close of each course, a guest signaled that they had finished eating not with any words at all, but with the simple, wordless placement of their own knife and fork, laid neatly together on the plate rather than left crossed or scattered. A small piece of silent choreography that told an attentive footman exactly when it was safe to clear a place, without needing to ask. By the 11th or 12th course, Constance finds herself managing these smaller rules almost entirely on instinct, the product of the same 3 evenings of kitchen table rehearsal that had already carried her successfully through the silver and the wine. She catches herself, once, reaching to tear a piece of bread the way she might at her own family's table, tearing a larger piece than strictly correct, and corrects the motion smoothly enough, she believes, that nobody at the table notices the small adjustment at all. She lays her own napkin loosely on the table at the very end of the meal rather than folding it, a gesture she had specifically rehearsed after reading, with some private astonishment, that folding it neatly would actually be the wrong choice in a house like this one rather than the polite one. This dense accumulation of minor rules is, in a sense, the whole story of the evening compressed into its smallest possible pieces. No single rule among them, the napkin, the bread, the angle of a spoon, could by itself ruin a guest's standing at a table like the Callaways. What mattered, cumulatively, was whether the 100 small decisions required across 3 hours of eating were made without visible hesitation, one after another, in a continuous, unbroken performance of ease. A single missed detail might pass entirely unnoticed. A guest who visibly had to think through each one, pausing fractionally before every small choice the way a person reads an unfamiliar language rather than speaking their own, told the room something quite different, no matter how good their intentions or how carefully they had actually studied beforehand. Much of what looked, from across the table, like natural, unthinking grace was, for at least one guest that evening, the product of dozens of small, deliberately memorized decisions executed in real time, with no room allowed for a single visible pause. A small printed card had been set at every place before the guests ever sat down, so unremarkable in appearance that a first glance might easily mistake it for a decorative afterthought rather than one more small, quiet test folded into an evening that was already full of them. The card listed the evening's 14 courses in order, allowing a guest to pace their own appetite across the meal with some idea of what still lay ahead. A welcome courtesy in a dinner this long and this heavily sequenced. The difficulty, such as it was, lay in the language the card was written in, since a fashionable household of the Callaway's standing printed its menu almost entirely in French. Following a continental convention that had dominated elite European dining for the better part of a century and showed no sign of loosening its grip by 1885. A dish might appear on the card simply as consomme, or vol au vent, or a saddle of mutton listed under a French name considerably grander than the English words for roasted lamb, and a guest was assumed to recognize each term well enough to know roughly what was about to arrive without needing to ask, or worse, without needing to wait and see. Providing an English translation alongside the French, an option some etiquette writers acknowledged existed for smaller or less formal occasions, was itself a mildly risky choice for a hostess of real standing, since offering a translation could be read as a quiet suggestion that her guests might not already possess the fluency a household like hers took entirely for granted. Constance had encountered most of the terms on her card before, from the same borrowed household guide that had walked her through the Order of the Silver, and she moves down the little printed list with reasonably steady confidence until she reaches a dish described only as a bomb. A word she recognizes vaguely as something to do with ice, but cannot place with any real precision. She does what she has quietly trained herself to do throughout the evening whenever a genuine gap in her knowledge appears. Saying nothing, asking nothing, and simply waiting for the dish itself to arrive, at which point a beautifully molded dome of layered ices, considerably more elaborate than anything she could have pictured from the word alone, is set in front of her and resolves the question without her ever having needed to expose the gap at all. The French menu card is really a small window into a great deal of elite Victorian taste, an entire class culture organized, in food as in so much else, around a continental fashion that had been dominant since well before the Queen came to the throne, and that a household with real aspirations to sophistication was still expected to defer to as a matter of course. French culinary vocabulary functioned, in a room like the Callaway's dining room, exactly the way the correct fork or the correct wine functioned as a language a guest was assumed to have absorbed somewhere along the way, through travel, through a fashionable governess, through the simple accumulated exposure of a childhood spent among people who already spoke it, rather than through any single lesson anyone could point to and say, "Here, this is where I learned it." A guest fluent in that vocabulary passed through the evening's menu without a flicker of hesitation. A guest still building that fluency, one borrowed guidebook at a time, managed the same card through careful patience and, when patience failed, through simply waiting for the plate to answer the question the word itself would not. Even a small courtesy, meant to help guests navigate a long and demanding meal, had been quietly folded by the culture surrounding it into one more opportunity to sort the guests who belonged from the guests still learning how to. Nothing about the card was hostile in its intention. It simply assumed a shared fluency that not every guest reading it that evening actually possessed, and the gap between the assumption and the reality was, once again, left entirely for each individual guest to manage in whatever quiet way they could. Even walking out of the Callaway's front door at the end of the evening did not actually close the account. It opened a new one, with its own deadline, and Constance understood this every bit as clearly as she had understood the rule about the fish knife. Custom required that a guest who had been entertained at dinner return the courtesy within a fairly narrow window, generally within a week to 10 days, by paying a formal call at the hostess's own home during the hours she had set aside for receiving visitors. If the lady of the house happened to be out, or simply not receiving that particular afternoon, a guest left a calling card with a servant at the door, and a small, widely understood convention let a visitor indicate that they had come in person rather than sending the card by post or by a servant of their own, by turning down one corner of the card before handing it over. If the hostess was at home and willing to receive, the visit itself was expected to run no longer than 15 or 20 minutes, long enough to demonstrate proper attention and gratitude, short enough not to presume on more of her time than a first return call actually warranted. calling too soon after the dinner risked appearing overeager. A household anxious to seem closer to the Calloways than their new and still fragile acquaintance actually justified. Calling too late, or worse, not calling at all, risked reading as something considerably colder, either simple bad manners or a quiet, deliberate signal that the acquaintance was not one the Hartleys cared to pursue any further. Constance and Edmund discussed the timing of this call more than once over the following days, weighing a Tuesday against a Thursday with a seriousness that would have looked, to an outside observer, wildly disproportionate to the actual decision at hand. They settle on the following Wednesday, within the accepted window, and inside Mrs. Calloway's published afternoon hours for receiving, and Constance dresses for the visit with almost as much care as she gave to the dinner itself, aware that this second appearance would either confirm or quietly undo whatever good impression the first one had managed to create. Mrs. Calloway receives them for a correct, pleasant quarter of an hour, offers tea, asks after Edmund's firm, and gives no particular sign, one way or the other, of how the previous week's dinner had actually been judged. Constance leaves the house no more certain of her own standing than she had been arriving, only reasonably confident that she had once again done nothing to make that standing any worse. The broader picture here is one of hospitality functioning less like a single evening's pleasure and more like an ongoing ledger, each invitation and each visit logged, consciously or not, against everything that had come before it. Judith Flanders has described Victorian social life in precisely these terms: an economy of obligation running quietly alongside the economy of money, in which a family's standing depended as much on correctly managing the timing of a call as on correctly managing the timing of a payment. Failing to keep either ledger balanced carried real consequences, and a household with social ambitions like the Hartleys had to learn to read both accounts with equal care, since a lapse in either one could undo months of otherwise careful work. What this final small ritual makes clear, more plainly than almost anything else in this whole account, is that the evening at the Calloways' table was never actually a single self-contained event with a beginning and an end. It was one entry in a running account that had started before Constance ever put on her gown and would continue for as long as she and Edmund hoped to remain inside this particular circle. Each dinner, each call, each carefully timed card left at a door, another small transaction in a ledger that was never, in any meaningful sense, allowed to close. Somewhere in the middle of that long run of courses, tucked between the heavier dishes without ever calling attention to itself, sat the one moment of the evening that came closest to actual, unguarded pleasure, and even that moment turned out to be governed by its own careful restraint. If you picture a 14-course Victorian dinner as one long, unbroken climb from soup to dessert, each course simply heavier and more elaborate than the last, you are missing the small deliberate pause built directly into the middle of it. Between the fish and entrees on one side and the roast and game on the other, a well-appointed table of this kind commonly served a course of ice, often called Roman punch, a frozen, semi-liquid concoction of rum, citrus, sugar, and whipped egg white, finished with a splash of champagne and served in a small glass rather than on a plate. Its purpose was explicitly digestive, a deliberate interruption meant to refresh a palate already worked through several rich courses and settle a stomach before it faced the heavier meat courses still to come. A genuine piece of period culinary science dressed up as an elegant little treat. The recipe, later formalized and popularized by the great French chef Auguste Escoffier, proved durable enough to survive long past the 14-course dinner itself, still appearing on the first-class dinner menu of the Titanic nearly 30 years later, on the same principle that had made it useful at the Calloways' table in 1885. What made Roman punch unusual, in the context of everything else this evening had demanded, was that it was one of the only courses a guest was actually permitted to enjoy without immediately performing restraint around it. The rum and champagne gave it a genuine, noticeable warmth, a small, sanctioned lift in the middle of an otherwise long and carefully governed evening, and etiquette writers of the period, so exacting about nearly everything else that touched a guest's lips, treated the punch with something close to indulgence, understanding it as a practical necessity rather than a vanity to be rationed. Constance, reaching the punch a few courses after her own hunger had become honestly difficult to ignore, finds it startling in the best possible sense. Cold and bright and considerably more potent than she expected from something served in so small a glass. She allows herself the full, small portion rather than the token sip she has been rationing herself to all evening, reasoning, correctly, that this particular course was one nobody would judge her for actually finishing. It is, in its own modest way, the closest she comes all night to simply enjoying something rather than managing it, and she notices the difference immediately. A small, private thaw in an evening that has otherwise asked her to hold herself carefully in check from the soup course onward. Even this one moment of sanctioned relief, though, sat inside its own quiet limits. The punch came in a single small glass, not a larger one, and a guest who asked for a second helping of it would have violated the same rule against visible appetite that governed every other course that evening, regardless of how openly the course itself seemed to invite enjoyment. The evening had found room for a single, carefully measured pause in its own relentless self-discipline. And even that pause, on closer inspection, turned out to be exactly as measured and exactly as disciplined as everything surrounding it. Step back far enough from any single fork, any single glass, any single turn of the table, and a handful of larger patterns start to emerge from an evening that, up close, looked like nothing more than an unusually elaborate meal among comfortable, well-dressed people. The first pattern is that ease, in a room like the Calloway's dining room, was never actually free. It was manufactured, at real cost, by people the room itself had trained everyone not to notice. A guest's effortless reach for the correct fork was often the product of years spent absorbing the rule without ever consciously learning it. Or, for a guest like Constance, of 3 deliberate evenings spent rehearsing at a borrowed kitchen table after the household had gone to bed. A hostess's smooth, unhurried pacing of 14 courses was the product of a kitchen running at something close to its physical limit 2 floors below, timed by a cook and a butler whose names no guest at that table would ever think to ask for. A woman's upright, apparently effortless posture through 3 hours of conversation was the product of a corset quietly restricting her own breath the entire time. Nothing about the evening's surface ease was accidental, and almost none of the labour producing it was ever meant to be visible from where the guests were sitting. The second pattern is that the whole elaborate apparatus, the silver, the courses, the celery in its expensive vase, existed primarily to solve a problem money alone could no longer solve by itself. By 1885, a rapidly widening middle class could actually afford most of what a table like the Calloways displayed. A family like the Hartleys, stretching their budget carefully, could buy a fine gown, a proper set of table silver, even a cut-glass celery vase indistinguishable at a glance from an aristocratic original. What that money could not buy directly was the unhesitating, unconscious fluency with which a lifetime of practice allowed a guest to use all of it without a flicker of visible thought, and it was precisely that fluency, rather than the objects themselves, that the entire evening was quietly built to test. A rising class could purchase every prop in the room. It could not purchase the years of ordinary, unremarked familiarity that made using those props look like nothing at all. The third pattern, closely related to the second, is that the test itself never really ended, no matter how well a guest happened to pass it on any given evening. Constance's vigilance did not stop when the last course was cleared, or when the carriage pulled away from the Calloway's door, or even when she was finally, gratefully unlaced at midnight. It continued into the drawing rooms where that evening's small missteps, real or imagined, were quietly assembled into settled opinion over the following days. It continued into the careful calculation of exactly which day and which hour to pay a return call, a decision weighed with as much seriousness as the seating plan that had opened the whole evening in the first place. There was no point at which a guest in Constance's position could simply relax into belonging. because belonging itself was never granted once and permanently. It had to be continuously reaffirmed, dinner after dinner, call after call, for as long as a family hoped to remain inside the circle at all. The fourth pattern, and perhaps the least comfortable one to sit with, is that almost nobody in that dining room, including the guests who had been born into this world and never once had to rehearse a single piece of it, was actually experiencing the evening as pleasure in any simple sense. Mrs. Calloway, orchestrating the turn of the table and the timing of every course with practiced, unhurried authority, was performing her own kind of labour, every bit as continuous and every bit as unacknowledged as the labour happening below stairs, even if hers came dressed in comfort rather than exhaustion. The men, withdrawing to their port and cigars, were relieved of one set of rules only to submit to another, quieter set governing exactly what could and could not be said in that room either. Even the guests who moved through the whole evening without a single visible hesitation were still, in their own way, performing constantly, simply performing a version so thoroughly absorbed since childhood that it no longer registered to them as effort at all. The absence of visible strain was not evidence of an absence of strain. It was evidence of a strain so old and so well practiced that it had stopped feeling like anything worth noticing, which is its own particular kind of exhausting, however comfortable it might have looked from across the room. What ties all four patterns together is a simple, almost uncomfortable recognition. A Victorian dinner party of this kind was never really organized around food or even around pleasure in any way its guests would have readily admitted to themselves. It was organized around the continuous, exhausting work of proving, course after course, glass after glass, small rule after small rule, that a person belonged exactly where they were sitting, and it demanded that proof from everyone in the room, whether they had been reciting the rules from memory since childhood or teaching them to their own hands for the very first time, 3 nights running. At a borrowed kitchen table nobody at the Calloways would ever hear about. Picture that table again, the way it looked an hour before anyone sat down at it. The damask ironed flat and carried upstairs like a stretcher. The candelabra catching the gaslight. The 24 pieces of silver laid out in a row, so precise it might have been measured with a ruler, because in a house like this one, it very nearly had been. The tall glass vase in the exact centre of the cloth, holding its single, perfectly trimmed head of celery upright, like a small pale trophy nobody at the table would ever think to question. It is, by any reasonable measure, a beautiful arrangement, warm and generous and entirely convincing, exactly the kind of image a period drama would linger on. Gauzy light, gleaming crystal. A room built to look like effortless plenty. It was never effortless, and by now you know most of what that particular word was hiding. You know that a servant's whole afternoon went into flattening a single tablecloth, and that 2 floors below the gleaming dining room a cook and a butler were coordinating 14 separate courses through a kind of continuous, low-grade crisis management no guest upstairs was ever meant to glimpse. You know that the celery in its expensive vase was a genuine luxury, months of trenching and careful blanching condensed into a single decorative stalk, and that the cheerful glass of Roman punch handed round partway through the meal was the one course a guest was actually permitted to enjoy without immediately managing that enjoyment. You know that the china might have been glazed with lead nobody in that room could see or taste, that the oysters opening the meal carried a risk medicine had not yet fully named, and that somewhere behind every relaxed, unhurried conversation sat a woman quietly timing when to turn her own attention from one guest to the next. And you know Constance Hartley, 34 years old, a solicitor's wife, 3 careful evenings into teaching her own hands a language she was never born speaking, sitting at that table in a corset laced an inch too tight, hungry by the 9th course of 14, watching another woman's fork to know when to turn her own conversation, dipping a stalk of celery in salt with the one piece of cutlery the whole evening did not require her to think about. She was not, on close inspection, the effortless picture a stranger glancing down that gleaming table might have assumed her to be. She was a woman working very hard, all evening, to look exactly like someone who was not working at all. She is not, for that reason, someone to feel sorry for, and it would be a mistake to close this account on a note of pity rather than clear sight. Constance passed her own test that night through genuine skill she had built for herself, alone, at a borrowed kitchen table, with nobody watching and nobody to thank for it but her own patient repetition. She is resilient, resourceful, and quietly exhausted. 3 things that can all be true of the same person at the same dinner table without contradicting one another in the slightest. The performance she gave that evening was, in its own modest way, extraordinary. The machinery required to produce it, the corset, the rehearsal, the careful arithmetic of a hired cab and a borrowed hairdresser, was considerably less glamorous than the performance itself, and both halves of that equation belong equally to her story. It is worth remembering, too, that Constance was very far from the only person at that table quietly working. Mrs. Beatrice Calloway, born into this world rather than studying her way into it, still spent the entire evening tracking a dozen conversations, timing every course against her own plate, and reading the room closely enough to catch a hesitation the moment it happened. Her labour simply wore a different costume, dressed in comfort and long habit rather than in visible strain, which made it easy to mistake for no labour at all. The husbands withdrawing to their port were relieved of one set of rules only to take up another, quieter set, about exactly what could be said in that room, and to whom. Even the guests who had never once had to rehearse a fork were still performing something, a version so completely absorbed into their own bodies since childhood that it no longer registered to them as work, in much the way a fluent speaker no longer notices the grammar of their own first language. Effortlessness, in that dining room, was never actually the absence of effort. It was simply effort old enough and practiced enough to have stopped announcing itself. There is a version of this evening that period dramas have told for 100 years, all warm light and clever dialogue and the comfortable certainty that everyone at the table already belongs there. It is a lovely image, and it leaves out almost everything that actually happened in that room. It leaves out the 3 nights Constance spent alone with borrowed silverware after her husband had gone to bed. It leaves out the ache across her ribs by the 6th course, the hunger she was not permitted to name by the 9th, the careful 2-fingered gesture across a wineglass she did not want, the private arithmetic of a gown that would have to serve for at least 2 more engagements before either she or Edmund could justify another one. None of that is a flaw in the story. It is the story, the part the portraits and the polished dramas leave for someone else to notice. It would be easy, from this distance, to feel a kind of comfortable pity for a world that demanded so much invisible labour simply to sit through a meal, and easier still to assume that world has nothing left to say to the one most people watching this actually live in. That assumption does not survive close contact with the evening itself. Anyone who has ever smoothed their expression before walking into a room full of strangers, or quietly watched another person's fork to work out which one to use, or calculated exactly how many days to wait before returning a favour, already knows something of what that dinner table was built to demand. The costumes have changed. The particular tools of the performance, the fish knives, the celery vases, the calling cards left with a corner turned down, have mostly gone quiet in glass cases in museum collections. The underlying instinct, to watch, to calculate, to appear at ease while working very hard not to, proved considerably more durable than any of the objects built to serve it. None of this survives by accident. Nobody in 1885 kept a diary explaining what the fish knife was actually for, or how tightly a corset ought to be laced for a dinner party rather than an ordinary afternoon, because everyone at that table already knew, and knowledge that common rarely gets written down at all. What we know now comes from patient, unglamorous work. Household guides like Mrs. Beaton's and Castle's read closely for the instructions they took for granted, the rare surviving diary of a servant like Hannah Cullowick, museum drawers full of grape shears and celery vases nobody living remembers using, and historians, Judith Flanders and Catherine Hughes among them, along with dress historians like Valerie Steele and living history researchers like Ruth Goodman, who have spent careers reconstructing exactly this kind of ordinary, undocumented evening from its scattered physical traces. An evening like the Calloways left no single record of its own. It left 1,000 small ones, a vase, a card, a corset, a footnote in someone else's memoir. And the whole of it only comes back into focus when all of those small traces are set down together, side by side, and read with the same patient attention a restorer gives to an old, darkened painting. That patience is worth the effort, and not simply because the details are curious or the celery vase makes for an amusing footnote at a modern dinner table. A meal reconstructed, this closely gives back something a single formal portrait never could. The sense of a real woman inside the silk, rather than a costume standing in for one. Constance Hartley left no diary of her own, no letter describing the particular ache of a corset laced an inch too tight, or the private relief of a napkin she was allowed, for once, to leave unfolded. Thousands of women like her lived through evenings exactly like this one, and vanished from the record just as completely. Remembered, if at all, only as a name on a guest list or a signature in a visitor's book. Piecing together what an ordinary night actually cost a woman like her is not a way of feeling sorry for the past. It is simply a way of finally looking at it properly, with the lamps turned up rather than down, at the parts the original portrait was never designed to show. The candles on that table have long since burned down, the wax pooled and cooling in their silver holders. The Calloways' guests are home in their own beds, scattered across a dozen quiet streets, and Constance is finally, blessedly unlaced, breathing a full, unguarded breath for the first time since 4 o'clock that afternoon. Somewhere in the years ahead there will be other dinners, other tables, other silent tests she will walk into already half prepared for. Because a woman who has once learned this particular language rarely stops speaking it. But for tonight, the performance is finished, and she is asleep, and the table that looked so effortless by candlelight is only a table again, bare and cleared and quiet, asking nothing further of anyone until the next evening it is called upon to perform.